doubts being raised about the reliability of presidential decision-making in the United States, allies of the United States in Europe and in Asia are raising doubts about the so-called U.S. nuclear umbrella, about the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent. And that depends because our president is the sole decision maker for nuclear response decisions.
From the Times, it's The World in 10. Our guest today is Rose Gottemoeller, who was NATO's Deputy Secretary General, now at Stanford University. Rose, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
We've seen Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, all over the place in recent weeks. Warsaw, Paris, Pristina, Sarajevo, London, of course, in the Oval Office as well. What is he doing to keep the alliance together?
Got several strains of activity going, which are, I think, all equally important. First of all, he's keeping his lines of communication open with Donald Trump in the White House. And I thought the White House meeting a couple of weeks ago, he came in to force some criticism as, being too accommodating to the president. But I think he showed his skill at being a good communicator with this president. And it does take some skill to communicate with this president. And so, honestly, I thought it was a good White House meeting overall. There's clear, and I have to say in recent days, I've been surprised at how inside his administration, certain figures like J.D. Vance really seem, and this word was apparently used in this famous exchange now over Signal, that J.D. Vance loathes the Europeans. And I was quite surprised at that wording. I don't think President Trump loathes the Europeans, but he wants them to spend more for their own defense. And that's been clear, way back from when I was Deputy Secretary General at Nato. So, and that was in 2017. So Trump needs to be handled and handled very deftly. And it does seem to me that Rutte is doing that very, very well. But he also is reaching out strongly to the Europeans and really talking to them very clearly and succinctly. I saw he was just in Warsaw in Poland overnight giving a speech and used this term that I thought was very interesting when he said that whoever tries to challenge this fierce alliance will be sorry, or words to that effect. But I noted his use of the word, this fierce alliance, and I thought that's very good. It's very good to be clear that the allies are gathering together and committed to the continuing joint defense of Europe, and are portraying themselves as very capable in military terms. Indeed, a fierce alliance. So Rutte is really doing, I think, a good job in getting out the message that, yes, we'll continue to work in every way we can with the Americans, but also we are ready to continue to work to develop our own skills, our own capacity and capability, and be ready to defend ourselves come what may.
We saw big smiles in the Oval Office as he met with Donald Trump. What is it that he'll need to say to Mr. Trump to keep the US president on side?
I think for Mr. Trump, the continuing emphasis on more defense expenditure, more capacity. And recently, I think because the European allies realize perhaps in the future they won't be able to count on the United States for these key enablers, so-called. These are things like ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, things like the tanking capabilities for, tankers for retanking aircraft on flight, different kinds of satellite capabilities for communications. I think the allies are just realizing now we have got to get these capabilities ourselves. It may take us 10 years, but we just can't count on the Americans being ready to provide us with that kind of backup in enabling our armed forces to operate. And so that kind of message also is very good for Mr. Trump to hear that, we're really developing ourselves as an independent capability and capacity. And I think the more the allies talk in that way, more independent capability and capacity, more ability to do it ourselves, the more they can actually count on the Trump administration being ready to continue to be involved in Europe and continue to be working together with the European NATO allies as well as with Canada. And we saw that, I think, also expressed in Pete Hegseth's memorandum to the Pentagon that was leaked last weekend or a weekend ago, when he said, what we want in Europe is not dependence, but allies. And what they mean by allies, they mean true allies that have all the military capability, all the defense capacity available to do what needs to be done. And then the United States can come in behind that as an equal ally to participate, but not as the ally who actually provides all the capability.
The fierce alliance, which will need more money and more capabilities, clearly. How precarious is the future of NATO right now?
Well, clearly, NATO is in a precarious position because its leading country, the country that was instrumental in the founding of NATO back in 1949, the United States of America, is, for whatever reason, turning its back slightly. The Obama administration started the notion of pivoting to Asia in order to be able to deal with the rising threat of China. So the Allies have been on notice for some time in Europe that the United States could be changing its focus to the Indo-Pacific and putting a lot more priority in the Indo-Pacific. So that does seem to be the case with this administration as well. This should not be any surprise to the Allies. They've had wake-up calls before, but now truly they're responding to those wake-up calls. And I think that that's the most important thing at this moment is that the response to the wake-up call seems to be ever heightened. And oh, by the way, that's also meant that NATO and the European Union are working more closely together and cooperating more closely together in a coherent way and a mutually beneficial way. When I was DSG, again, 5 years ago, Deputy Secretary General of NATO, often it seemed to me that the two institutions were butting heads more than cooperating. But I don't see that so much these days. They seem to have developed the capacity and the mechanisms to be able to work together effectively in a kind of division of labor way. And also the leaders of the two organizations are really intertwined. They're really working together well, communicate constantly. You see with Ursula von der Leyen talking to Rutte, and etc. There's a constant communication link going on. It's helpful, of course, that all those leaders know each other very well. They've been working together very well for the last decade or more. But I do think that in terms of NATO-EU cooperation, we've never been at a better place than we are right now.
Could we see perhaps members of the EU who are not members of NATO joining the alliance?
Well, possibly. I think we've seen those members join recently in Finland and Sweden. The countries that are left are Austria and the Republic of Ireland. I don't really, and well, places like Malta and so forth. I don't really see that happening, to be honest with you. Austria seems to have come to terms and accepted the notion that it will be a permanent neutral country, really in that borderland area between Russia and Europe. Seems to be at peace with that. And I don't even mean that ironically, but in political terms, it seems to be at peace with that long ago decision. And in some ways, that's, I think, the model the Russians have in mind of what they'd like to see with Ukraine. But Ukraine's got other ideas in mind and really has made its own decisions about what will ensure its security going forward. And again, I always like to stress that that is a very important aspect of how NATO thinks about allies and partners in Europe. Countries might choose to be partners of NATO or they might aspire to be allies. And that security choice really has to be up to them. It's not something that another country, such as Russia, should be designating or ordering anybody to do.
You touched on Hegseth's position, on J.D. Vance's position. How much of all this reflects that idea that one Trump advisor had, that they were keen on a dormant NATO, where Europe looked after itself? What could the alliance look like in future?
Well, the notion of a dormant NATO up against an aggressive Russia doesn't make any sense to me. a dormant body seems to be lying flat on its back, having a rest, and NATO cannot be in that kind of posture with an aggressive Russia on its borders. So it would have to be a NATO that continues to build up effective military capability and capacity. It will have to rearm itself. It will have to be at a high level of training and alert readiness, and it will have to be a very capable military alliance. I think, frankly, it has the advantage, no matter what happens with this peace process. I am sure that Ukraine will remain a partner of NATO, even if it cannot immediately join into NATO membership. And Ukraine, now having fought this war, has the most effective and most ready armed forces in Europe, and having them as a close partner of NATO, I think, will be helpful to ensure a high level of readiness in the NATO armed forces going forward.
Ukraine, more than any other country, has experience of how an aggressive Russia is changing the way it conducts war, the kind of hybrid warfare, deniable attacks. Is that something NATO can pivot to deal with in the coming years?
It absolutely must, because obviously this is a sophisticated game that gets more sophisticated every day. And new ideas are being tried out, supercharged by artificial intelligence and other means of driving misinformation and disinformation, hoaxes of all kinds, deep fakes in the information space. So countries and their leaders really have to be alert to this type of misinformation, disinformation, because we see it all the time now. Leaders getting faked out, and leaders do use their mobile phones more than they did in the past, and so they might think they're talking to another leader where it's actually somebody who's undermining what they're trying to do. So this is an area where I believe NATO must get better. I will say that, again, from my time as DSG, NATO was very alert to cyber attacks and the type of information security that is required to keep the headquarters running, to keep the IT systems up and running. And I think there's a lot of experience in NATO on dealing with cyber attacks. Look at what happened to Estonia as far back as 2007. And Estonia has become a huge leader in the alliance in ensuring cyber hygiene, as we say, cyber security, proper response to cyber attacks, and attributing cyber attacks to the countries that perpetrate them. So I think in some areas, NATO's actually really good, but then we have to watch these other areas that are emerging or re-emerging, interestingly enough. Sabotage was always part of the play, certainly during World War II, and in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies, they were masters of sabotage. They were up to tricks all the time. And during the 30 years after the end of the Cold War, we kind of dropped sabotage as something we had to worry about. Well, we have to worry about it again. And so I think we must, again, become more sophisticated, on our guard, and more resilient against these kinds of sabotage attacks.
Of course, Estonia has, along with Sweden and Finland, been at the forefront of dealing with those attacks with NATO, with these joint missions of late in the Baltic. Is that something that NATO is good at doing?
NATO has to get better. I do think that NATO has recognized in the past couple of years that this hybrid realm of warfare is one that it must redouble, or we say hybrid realm of warfare or irregular warfare. Again, this is something that the Soviets were excellent about. And we always understood it well during the Cold War. It was an aspect of what we were constantly fighting back against and had a good deal of resilience to. But it's a combination of more sophistication in the attacks and then just the unexpected aspect of the Russians now taking off the shelf these old Soviet techniques and modernizing them and bringing them to bear on such extraordinary, seems like almost a spy movie, right? Some of these things with cutting the cables in the Baltic Sea and other types of activities meant to disrupt communications across Europe. It's just extraordinary. I can't say what happened at Heathrow Airport. I know that that investigation is ongoing, the massive fire at the electric substation. So I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but these are the kinds of things that I think we have to be very much on the lookout for, whether attacks of that kind will be occurring that will be a major disruptor for our communication systems.
If we go back to Ukraine, the Trump administration seems to have dashed hopes of Ukraine ever joining NATO as a member. Do you see that position as standing going forward?
Well, there's a great deal of nuance in how this has been batted back and forth over the last couple of weeks. I like to tell people to read very carefully Mr. Hegseth's speech at the Defense Ministerial, which was on the Thursday before the Munich Security Conference. Obviously, it created a great deal of uproar at the time. But when I read it, I said, oh, this isn't too bad. What Hegseth said, very precisely, was that NATO membership for Ukraine cannot be on the table for this war termination package. I said, great, of course. We understood that. NATO membership cannot be achieved in a day. It is a process that the Ukrainians will go through. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have gotten the go-ahead from Moscow to proceed with accession talks to the European Union, and those accession talks began last June. To me, this is hugely ironic because it was the EU agreement that NATO was about to sign in 2012 that started, the brouhaha, the Maidan protests. The Russians tried to prevent that from happening. And then the Maidan protests and the first invasion of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, back 10 plus years ago. So it was the EU that was the initial barrier, but now the Russians are saying EU membership for NATO's fine. I mean, for Ukraine is fine. And now I'm saying everything that the Ukrainians do to get through their EU accession process. And as you know, they have to go through several chapters, very difficult, on governance, on fighting corruption, on dealing with the common agricultural policy, on bringing together standards of various kinds. All of these steps will also prepare Ukraine for NATO membership. So I would never give up on NATO membership for Ukraine, even if it cannot be part of this war termination package. And it should prepare for NATO membership in the way it's been doing by building up its armed forces, showing its very capable ability to fight if it has to. I mean, it's the most operationally ready army in Europe today. So that's one part. But then the other part is on the governance side, anti-corruption, etc. So working on that with the EU will prepare it for NATO membership as well. The thing to watch out for is if the Russians somehow demand that NATO, not the Ukrainians, but NATO, rescind the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit when the invitation was first issued to Ukraine as well as Georgia that they would become NATO members in future. I don't think, my view is that the Russians can't demand that of NATO, and if they do demand it of NATO, I don't think there'd be a NATO consensus to rescind that invitation.
What do you make of progress towards a war termination package so far?
Well, it's a bit disturbing overnight. We had this good news, or at least we thought, that the deal had been reached to resume cooperation on sea lines of communication and transportation through the Black Sea, that they should not be impeded. But the Russians are now claiming that until they get forgiveness of the sanctions that are preventing them from making payments for some of their transit activities through the European banking system, that no, they haven't agreed to anything. This is bad. This is such typical Russian negotiating tactics. They're back to an initial issue that they could not agree several years ago because they are under banking sanctions. And nobody was going to relieve that banking sanction as a kind of first step, it was feared, down a slippery slope of more and more release from banking sanctions. So nobody's in a mood to release them from those banking sanctions. And yet they're saying, well, No, we're not going to agree to this Black Sea transit situation. So it's to me, it's like typical Russian negotiating tactics. They may say, "Yeah, we're back to the table. We want to get this done. We're ready to get it done," and then all of a sudden they pull off the shelf, one of their old demands and say, "Oh, but wait a minute, we don't really agree until you do this too." It's really typical Russian negotiating tactics, and I thought, doesn't look so good. Also, doesn't look so good that the Ukrainians and the Russians apparently continue to hit each other with drone attacks overnight. The numbers seem to have gone down somewhat, but they are going to have to reach a time certain when they are saying, all right, no more drone attacks on critical infrastructure. And then it's just going to have to halt, or it's obvious the ceasefire will have come to naught.
One Russian negotiation that you have first-hand involvement in was the New START treaty, what is now the last remaining bit of nuclear arms control. That expires in 10 months. Moscow says prospects for it are bleak. Are we looking at a new nuclear proliferation coming up?
Well, we could if the major nuclear powers, UK, France, China, Russia, and the United States, do not get back to any negotiated attempts to control nuclear weapons. I happen to believe that there are new opportunities emerging, and I will come back to that in a moment. But one of the key issues now is because of doubts being raised about the reliability of presidential decision making in the United States. Allies of the United States in Europe and in Asia are raising doubts about the so-called U.S. nuclear umbrella, about the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent. And that depends because our president is the sole decision maker for nuclear response decisions. That depends on everybody being confident in the reliability of the president and presidential decision making. So, deterrence is a mind game, right? We can have nice, shiny new F-35s ready to deliver those B-61 bombs should we ever get into a nuclear crisis. But if there's lack of confidence in the decision-making reliability of the president, then that's a problem. So that's where we are right now, with several countries in both Europe and Asia now talking about acquiring their own nuclear weapons, or in the case of Europe, President Macron has made offers now to extend a French nuclear umbrella over Europe, which has less, I would say, less kind of practicality to it because it's a much, much smaller nuclear force. But we'll leave that to be debated by the arms control priesthood. In any event, there are concerns that are growing that other countries are going to say, hey, we need some nuclear weapons too. The Republic of Korea, that debate is very, very vigorous. Heard mentioned now in places like Poland and Germany, among some parliamentarians, maybe we need to be building up nuclear weapons too. So I think it's important at this moment. We have a president in the United States who has said, wow, I really want to get rid of nuclear weapons. And he said every week since he's been sworn into office, I don't think nuclear weapons are a good investment. I don't want to increase nuclear weapons. I want to limit and reduce nuclear weapons. I want a big denuclearization deal with Putin and Xi. He said that specifically. Okay, well, if he wants a big nuclear deal with Putin and Xi, he's going to have to pay attention also to these theater nuclear issues, the extended nuclear theater issues, and the deterrence questions there, because otherwise he's going to face maybe not more nuclear weapons among the big nuclear powers, but more nuclear weapons among new nuclear powers. And that is going to be extraordinarily destabilizing and go in the opposite direction to what the president says he wants to do, that is, achieve fewer nuclear weapons in the world.
Rose Gottemoeller, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.